The most striking truth about freedom shrinkage is that you never feel the walls moving in. You only feel the relief of not hitting them. We generally assume that a loss of liberty involves a locked door, right? But in these high-pressure dynamics, the most effective cage is actually the one you build for yourself, just to keep the peace. So why does a quiet, stable life often end up feeling like a tiny room where you're the only one who's not allowed to leave? Well, that is the core paradox of freedom shrinkage. The moment your own desire for harmony is used to make your world smaller, while theirs just keeps getting bigger.
Just think about that for a second. It's this incredible psychological sleight of hand. The whole process is so quiet, so gradual, that your brain completely misinterprets confinement as security. Every single time you choose not to do something to avoid a fight or some friction, your nervous system actually registers it as a win, a little moment of peace. But what's really happening? Well, you're building a boundary. You're part of a system where your world is methodically shrinking while someone else's is expanding to fill the exact space you just gave up. And that question right there is a central mystery we're going to dig into. How does the pursuit of a quiet, stable life sometimes lead to this suffocating feeling like you're the architect of your very own cage? And listen, this isn't about someone yelling no at you. It's way more subtle. It's about the slow, systematic adjustment of your entire world to fit someone else's convenience until you're the one enforcing your own limits. So today we're going to break down this phenomenon, which we're calling freedom shrinkage, not as some vague feeling, but as an observable system with clear rules and, honestly, predictable outcomes.
All right, so to really get this, here's our roadmap. First, we're going to look at the blueprint for how this confinement gets designed. Then, we'll see exactly how the walls move in, step by step. After that, we'll dig into the psychology of the cage itself, and then look at some tools for mapping your own territory. And finally, we'll redefine what true peace actually looks like. Let's dive in.
Okay, first things first, it is so important to understand that what we're talking about here is a behavioral system. We're moving way beyond just feeling trapped, and we're going to look at the actual architecture of that trap. It's a fundamental shift in your entire life's operating system. From one of active exploration and growth, where you're the main character in your own story, to one of just passive maintenance and confinement, where you basically become a supporting character in someone else's.
So there's actually a scientific term for this process. It's called behavioral narrowing, and it's a well-documented phenomenon where a person's world just systematically gets smaller. You see this pattern in really specific environments. Think about those all-consuming tech startups that demand your whole life, or high-control social circles, or even relationships where your loyalty is kind of measured by how much of the outside world you're willing to give up. It's this slow, quiet phasing out of your own life, one dropped hobby and one canceled coffee date at a time.
So how does this narrowing actually happen? Well, the main tool is something we call the complexity tax. Here's how it works. Anything you want to do for yourself, seeing a friend, taking a class, going after a goal, is made emotionally expensive. You're met with sighs, passive aggression, guilt trips, just enough friction to make you think, you know what, it's easier to stay home. Over time, paying this tax leads to what some people call the evaporation effect, where your friends and your goals, even parts of your personality, just slowly seem to disappear. Not because someone told you no, but because you were taxed into giving them up yourself.
And the result of paying that complexity tax over and over again? That's environmental atrophy. Your world, which was once huge and interesting, it just slowly shrinks into this tiny, predictable, repetitive loop. And that loop is centered entirely around someone else's needs, their schedule, their approval. This is the critical turning point, the moment you stop managing your life and you start managing their reactions. You begin to self-police your own desires. You shift from being an independent person into a dependent, like a satellite orbiting their world.
So this really lays out the two paths, right? On one side, you've got autonomous expansion. That's life as it should be, where your world is always getting bigger and richer. But freedom shrinkage, it forces the exact opposite, passive contraction. You start shedding parts of yourself, those friends that are suddenly too much drama, the hobbies that now cause friction, interests that aren't shared, all just to fit more neatly into someone else's life. That's a whole mechanism designed to make sure that when you finally look up, there's really nowhere else for you to go.
So how does this actually play out in real life? Let's break down the step-by-step pattern that makes this shrinkage happen, because it isn't random. It's a quiet, systematic process of behavioral management that happens in a very predictable order. It basically unfolds in 3 stages. First, like we said, the complexity tax gets introduced. It just makes your independent life feel like a huge burden. Second, contingent approval gets established. Now this is a huge shift, because it's when you realize you only feel good or safe or at peace when you're doing exactly what the other person wants. Your well-being becomes conditional on your compliance. This literally rewires your brain's reward system. which leads right to the final and most important stage, the internalized perimeter.
And this is exactly how that perimeter gets built. See, our brains are wired to avoid stress, so you learn to predict what's going to cause friction. Their reaction leads to your exhaustion, which then leads to your self-restriction. You actually stop wanting things before you even ask because you've already run the numbers and calculated the emotional cost, and you've decided it's just too high. You become your own gatekeeper, patrolling the very walls you were conditioned to build in the first place.
The end result of this whole cycle is a state called behavioral desuetude. Now, desuetude is just a fancy word for a state of disuse. And in this context, it means the very habit of wanting things for yourself just starts to fade away. Your brain has been so effectively conditioned to see independence as conflict and shrinkage as peace that your confidence erodes. People in this state often report that they don't even know what they want anymore because the muscle of personal desire has atrophied from lack of use.
Okay, so we've covered the what and the how. Now let's get into the why. What are the psychological drivers that make this dynamic so incredibly effective? Well, it all boils down to a fundamental conflict of motivations. And right here, you can see the core mismatch. On one side, the motivation is often something we can call total resource monopolization. Basically, if someone can make themselves your only source of validation, your only source of information, and your only source of activity, they gain absolute leverage. And on the other side, the vulnerability being exploited is usually a deep-seated need for social harmony. So many of us are conditioned to value not being a problem more than we value having a life.
Now, this whole dynamic works so well because it's pulling a powerful biological lever inside of us, aversion conditioning. I mean, our brains are literally hardwired to avoid things that cause us pain. The complexity tax effectively weaponizes this instinct. It repeatedly associates your friends, your hobbies, your goals, everything that makes you you with social pain and friction. So you naturally start to avoid them, not out of weakness, but as a predictable biological response to repeated stress.
So the entire system is designed to rewrite your internal compass. A person's guiding question literally shifts from "what makes me happy" to "is this okay?" Your life stops being about desire and becomes entirely about permission. Your own wants and needs become secondary to just seeking approval, and that shift can happen so quietly, so subtly, that you don't even realize the question has changed.
All right, so now that we understand the system, how can you recognize if your world is actually shrinking? Now, this section isn't about blaming anyone or taking some big action. It's simply about developing awareness. It's about learning to be a neutral map maker of your own life, just mapping your territory without any judgment.
A really simple but powerful tool for this is what we'll call the Two-Year Audit. It's a totally non-judgmental exercise. You just ask yourself one question. Objectively, is my world, my social life, my intellectual life, my range of experiences, is it bigger or smaller than it was 2 years ago? The goal isn't to find fault, it's just to see the trajectory. It's like an accountant looking at a balance sheet. You're just observing if you're in a state of expansion or contraction. And when you're doing this audit, you can look at some really specific, concrete areas, like your social circle. Are your friends your own, or are they mostly shared? Do you see them by yourself? What about personal opinions? Are there topics you just don't bring up anymore to avoid the friction? And what about your sense of self? Do you feel more defined, more vibrant than you did 2 years ago, or less? These questions help turn a vague feeling into real data. This audit can lead you to a pretty big aha moment, something we could call micro-expansion awareness. This is that critical insight where you suddenly realize that your lack of interest in things you used to love, it might not be real apathy. It might actually be a learned protective response to all that manufactured friction. It's not that you don't want to go out with that friend, it's that your brain has learned that just wanting it is too exhausting. And that awareness, it leads to the one key thought that can interrupt this entire behavioral cycle. It's the simple but radical acceptance of this idea. I am allowed to cause a little friction to keep my freedom. Now, this isn't about starting a fight. It's about recognizing that avoiding all friction at the cost of your own world is just too high a price to pay. It's like a permission slip you write for yourself, and it's the one thing that can stop that internalized perimeter from completely solidifying. And all of this brings us to our final, and maybe most important point. To break this cycle, we have to completely re-examine what we even mean when we use the word peace. Let that one sink in for a minute. This central deal that's offered in Freedom Shrinkage is your autonomy in exchange for harmony. But this quote completely reframes that deal. Peace that is purchased with essential parts of yourself, with your freedom to grow, to exist independently. That isn't peace at all. It's a surrender. It's a unilateral ceasefire where you are the only one laying down your arms. True, sustainable peace simply cannot exist without autonomy.
Ultimately, the most dangerous walls aren't the ones other people build. They're the ones we build ourselves just to avoid rocking the boat. Awareness is the key to making sure that no one else's convenience becomes a cage for your own growth. And sometimes, reclaiming your territory, your life, and your own expansion, well, it means you have to be willing to make a little noise. You have to be willing to open the door, even if you've been conditioned to fear the sound it makes.